During the Second World War, the skies above Europe became one of the most dangerous battlefields ever created. Thousands of aircraft crossed the continent every night and every day carrying bombs, supplies, or fighters searching for enemy planes. Among all these machines, one aircraft slowly gained a reputation that even enemy pilots began to respect and fear. It was a large American bomber covered in gun turrets and heavy armor that seemed almost impossible to destroy. The aircraft became known as the B-17 Flying Fortress. Long before the United States officially entered the war, American military planners believed that the future of warfare would depend heavily on long-range bombing. Their idea was simple but bold. Instead of focusing only on front-line battles, armies could strike directly at the enemy's industrial power. Factories, railways, oil refineries and shipyards were the engines that kept armies fighting. If those targets could be destroyed from the air, the enemy's ability to continue the war would slowly collapse. To carry out such a strategy, the United States needed a bomber that could fly long distances, carry heavy bomb loads, and defend itself deep inside enemy territory. Engineers began working on a design that would eventually become one of the most famous bombers in history. When the aircraft was first tested in the 1930s, it impressed observers with its size and strength. It had 4 powerful engines that allowed it to fly high above many enemy fighters and anti-aircraft guns. Its wings were wide and strong, capable of carrying large bomb loads across long distances. But the feature that truly made the aircraft unique was its defensive firepower. Unlike earlier bombers that carried only a few defensive guns, the new aircraft was covered with machine gun positions. Gunners were placed in the nose, on the top of the fuselage, underneath the aircraft, and in the tail. Later versions added even more guns on the sides of the plane. This massive defensive armament gave the aircraft its famous nickname, the Flying Fortress. The idea behind the design was that a formation of these bombers could defend itself without needing constant fighter escort. When several B-17 bombers flew together, their gun turrets created overlapping fields of fire. Enemy fighters attempting to attack the formation would suddenly face dozens of heavy machine guns firing at them from multiple directions. This made attacking the bomber formation extremely dangerous. When the United States entered the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor, large numbers of these bombers were quickly sent to Europe. American commanders believed that daylight bombing could strike important German factories and transportation networks with precision. While British bombers usually attacked cities at night, American B-17 crews flew their missions during the day where they could see their targets more clearly. This decision placed them directly in the path of German fighter aircraft and anti-aircraft defenses. Early missions quickly proved just how dangerous the skies over Germany could be. German fighter pilots were experienced and aggressive. They understood that the heavy American bombers were a serious threat to the industrial heart of Germany. As a result, they launched repeated attacks against bomber formations crossing occupied Europe. Fighters armed with cannons and machine guns approached from different angles, trying to break the bomber formations apart. Anti-aircraft guns from the ground also filled the skies with exploding shells known as flak. For the crews inside the bombers, every mission was a test of survival. The inside of a B-17 during combat was loud, cramped, and extremely cold. Because the aircraft flew at very high altitudes, the temperature inside the bomber could drop far below freezing. Crew members wore heavy suits and oxygen masks while performing their duties. Each bomber carried a crew of 10 men, including pilots, navigators, bombardiers, radio operators, and several gunners. Every person on board had a specific role and the survival of the aircraft depended on teamwork between all of them. As the bombers approached enemy territory, tension inside the aircraft would slowly rise. Gunners carefully watched the sky through their sights, searching for approaching fighters. The navigator constantly checked the aircraft's position while the bombardier prepared the bombs for release. When enemy fighters finally appeared, the calm routine of the mission suddenly turned into chaos. German fighters dived toward the bomber formations, firing powerful cannons capable of tearing through metal and engines. Yet the bombers fought back with incredible defensive firepower. Machine guns from every direction opened fire, creating a deadly wall of bullets around the formation. Many German pilots later described how dangerous it was to attack these bombers directly. Flying straight toward a formation of B-17 aircraft meant flying into a storm of machine gun fire. Some fighters attempted to attack from the sides or from behind, while others launched rockets from longer distances. Even with these tactics, the bomber formations remained extremely difficult to destroy. One of the reasons the aircraft became famous was its ability to survive heavy damage. Many B-17 bombers returned from missions with large holes in their wings or fuselage. Some aircraft lost engines yet continued flying for hundreds of kilometers to return to base. There were cases where bombers came back with entire sections of their tails damaged or parts of their wings missing. Ground crews often stared in disbelief when these damaged aircraft landed safely. Photographs taken after missions showed bombers covered with bullet holes and flak damage that seemed impossible to survive. These images quickly spread among Allied forces and strengthened the reputation of the Flying Fortress as one of the toughest aircraft of the war. But the courage of the crews inside these aircraft was just as important as the strength of the machine itself. Each mission required bomber crews to fly deep into heavily defended enemy territory, knowing that many aircraft might never return. Losses during some early bombing campaigns were extremely high. Entire bomber formations sometimes suffered heavy casualties when German defenses were particularly strong. Yet the missions continued because destroying enemy industry was considered essential for winning the war. As the war progressed, the role of the B-17 bomber grew even larger. Massive formations containing hundreds of bombers began crossing the skies over Europe. Factories, oil refineries, railway yards and military bases became regular targets. The combined bombing campaigns of the United States and Britain slowly began weakening Germany's industrial power. German fighter units were forced to defend their homeland while fuel supplies and aircraft production facilities were increasingly damaged by bombing raids. Eventually, the skies above Germany filled with enormous bomber formations protected by long-range fighter escorts such as the P-51 Mustang. These escorts could travel the entire distance with the bombers and defend them from enemy fighters. This dramatically increased the survival chances of the bomber crews. The combination of heavily armed bombers and powerful escort fighters made Allied air power extremely difficult for Germany to stop. By the final years of the war, the B-17 Flying Fortress had become one of the most recognizable aircraft of World War II. Its long wings, multiple gun turrets and powerful engines symbolized the growing strength of Allied air forces. German pilots still attacked these bombers whenever possible, but they knew they were facing one of the most heavily defended aircraft ever built. The Flying Fortress had earned its name in the skies of Europe through thousands of missions and countless battles against fighters and anti-aircraft guns. It became not only a weapon of war but also a symbol of determination and endurance for the crews who flew it. As the number of American bombing missions over Europe increased, the German military quickly realized that the B-17 Flying Fortress represented a serious and growing threat. These bombers were not simply attacking cities but were targeting the factories and industrial centers that kept the German war machine operating. Oil refineries, aircraft factories, ball-bearing plants, railway yards and submarine construction facilities were all placed on the target lists of Allied bombing planners. Each successful bombing raid damaged Germany's ability to produce weapons and supply its armies. Because of this, the German Air Force, known as the Luftwaffe, began developing new tactics specifically designed to destroy the heavily defended bomber formations. German fighter pilots understood that attacking a B-17 directly from behind or from the sides could be extremely dangerous because of the many machine guns protecting the aircraft. The tail gunner, top turret gunner and side gunners created overlapping fields of fire that made close attacks deadly for approaching fighters. As a result, German pilots began experimenting with different methods to break through the bomber defenses. One of the most common tactics was the head-on attack. Instead of approaching from behind, German fighters would fly directly toward the bomber formation from the front. This approach reduced the amount of time the fighters remained exposed to defensive gunfire and allowed their powerful cannons to fire directly into the nose of the bombers where the cockpit and bombardier positions were located. These attacks were extremely dangerous for both sides because the aircraft were closing toward each other at tremendous speeds. Pilots had only seconds to fire their weapons before pulling away to avoid collision. Another tactic used by German fighters involved attacking from high altitude and diving through the bomber formation while firing rockets or heavy cannons. Some fighters were equipped with powerful weapons designed specifically to destroy heavy bombers. These guns could tear apart engines and wings with only a few hits. Despite these efforts, the bomber formations remained difficult to destroy because the aircraft continued supporting each other with defensive fire. The American strategy relied heavily on tight bomber formations known as combat boxes. These formations placed several bombers at slightly different altitudes and positions so that every aircraft could cover the others with machine gun fire. When enemy fighters approached, they were forced to fly through a defensive network of dozens of guns firing at once. Even experienced fighter pilots had to be extremely careful when attacking these formations. One of the most intense periods of the air war over Europe came during the bombing campaigns of 1943. American commanders believed that by targeting key industrial facilities they could severely weaken Germany's ability to produce weapons. Among the most important targets were the ball-bearing factories located in the German city of Schweinfurt. Ball bearings were small metal components used in many machines including aircraft engines, tanks and vehicles. Without a steady supply of these parts, German factories would struggle to produce equipment for the military. Because of this, the factories at Schweinfurt became one of the most heavily defended industrial targets in Germany. In October 1943, a large formation of B-17 bombers was sent to attack the Schweinfurt factories. The mission quickly became one of the most famous and costly bombing raids of the war. As the bombers approached German airspace, they were met by waves of German fighter aircraft determined to stop them. Fighter pilots attacked again and again using head-on passes and rocket strikes against the bomber formations. Anti-aircraft guns from the ground filled the sky with exploding shells as the bombers moved toward their target. Inside the bombers, the crews experienced one of the most terrifying missions of their lives. Gunners fired continuously at approaching fighters while pilots struggled to keep their damaged aircraft in formation. Some bombers lost engines after being hit by cannon fire. Others suffered heavy structural damage from flak explosions. Yet many crews continued toward the target despite the danger. When the bombers finally reached Schweinfurt, the bombardiers released their bombs over the factory complexes below. Explosions tore through the industrial buildings, producing thick clouds of smoke rising over the city. The mission succeeded in damaging the factories, but the cost was extremely high. Many bombers were lost during the mission and dozens of crews were killed or captured. The heavy losses shocked American commanders and demonstrated how dangerous daylight bombing without long-range fighter escort could be. Despite these losses, the B-17 continued flying missions over Europe. Improvements in fighter escorts soon changed the situation dramatically. The arrival of long-range escort fighters such as the P-51 Mustang allowed American bombers to receive protection during the entire journey to Germany and back. These fighters could engage German interceptors before they reached the bomber formations, making attacks far more difficult for the Luftwaffe. With strong fighter escort, the bombers were able to continue their strategic bombing campaign more effectively. Over time, the combined bombing efforts of the United States and Britain placed enormous pressure on German industry. Factories were forced to stop production after bombing raids. Transportation networks were damaged and fuel supplies were reduced. German fighter units had to spend more time defending their own cities instead of supporting operations at the front lines. For the bomber crews flying these missions, the danger never completely disappeared. Every flight into enemy territory carried the risk of fighter attacks, flak explosions, and mechanical failure. Yet thousands of crews continued flying these missions throughout the war. The B-17 Flying Fortress became a symbol of these dangerous operations and of the determination of the men who flew them. Its reputation for strength and survivability continued growing as more stories emerged of bombers returning safely despite severe damage. Some aircraft landed with large holes in their wings while others flew hundreds of kilometers with damaged engines or control surfaces. These remarkable survivals added to the legend of the aircraft and reinforced the belief that the Flying Fortress was one of the toughest bombers ever built. By the final stages of the war, massive formations of these bombers filled the skies above Europe. Hundreds of aircraft flying together created a powerful force capable of striking deep inside enemy territory. The combination of heavy defensive armament, strong bomber formations, and long-range fighter escorts made the B-17 one of the most effective strategic bombers used during the Second World War. The aircraft had proven that long-range bombing could play a major role in modern warfare, and its impact on the outcome of the air war over Europe would be remembered long after the conflict ended. As the war moved into its final years, the presence of the B-17 Flying Fortress in the skies above Europe became almost constant. Massive formations of these bombers could often be seen stretching across the horizon like long metal rivers moving through the clouds. For many civilians living in occupied Europe or inside Germany, the deep sound of hundreds of engines approaching in the distance became a familiar and frightening signal that another bombing raid was about to begin. These formations sometimes included more than 200 bombers flying together in carefully organized combat boxes designed to protect each aircraft with overlapping defensive fire. When seen from the ground, the formation looked almost like a giant moving wall of aircraft slowly crossing the sky. German air defenses continued trying to stop these attacks, but the situation was becoming increasingly difficult. The Luftwaffe had already lost many experienced pilots during earlier years of the war, and fuel shortages were beginning to limit the number of training flights available for new pilots. At the same time, Allied fighter escorts were now protecting the bomber formations for the entire length of their missions. Fighters such as the P-51 Mustang and P-47 Thunderbolt were fast, heavily armed and capable of flying long distances alongside the bombers. When German fighters attempted to approach the bomber formations, they often had to fight through waves of escort fighters before they could even reach the bombers themselves. This dramatically reduced the number of successful interceptions. As a result, the B-17 formations were able to reach their targets more frequently and with fewer losses than during earlier bombing campaigns. The strategic bombing campaign gradually expanded to include many different types of targets. Oil refineries became especially important because fuel was essential for tanks, aircraft and military vehicles. By destroying these facilities, the Allies hoped to weaken the ability of the German military to continue fighting. Aircraft factories, transportation networks and communication centers were also attacked repeatedly. Over time, these bombing raids placed enormous pressure on German industry and forced factories to move production underground or disperse across multiple smaller locations. Even with these defensive measures, it became increasingly difficult for Germany to maintain stable production as bombing raids continued. The B-17 Flying Fortress played a major role in these operations. Thousands of these aircraft were produced during the war and they flew an enormous number of missions across Europe. Bomber crews faced danger during every mission, yet they continued flying day after day as part of the growing Allied air offensive. The aircraft itself earned a reputation not only for its firepower but also for its ability to survive heavy damage. There were many famous cases where B-17 bombers returned safely despite suffering damage that seemed impossible to survive. Some aircraft landed with large sections of their wings torn apart, while others flew home with only a single engine still operating. Photographs of these damaged bombers were widely shared and helped strengthen the legendary status of the aircraft. One particularly famous incident involved a B-17 that collided with another bomber in midair during a mission yet still managed to return safely to base. Another aircraft flew hundreds of kilometers with its nose almost completely destroyed after being hit by enemy fire. Stories like these spread quickly among bomber crews and reinforced their confidence in the strength of the Flying Fortress. Yet the aircraft alone could not win the war. The success of the bombing campaign depended heavily on the teamwork between bomber crews, fighter escorts, ground crews and intelligence planners who selected targets. Thousands of people worked together to plan and execute each mission. Mechanics prepared the aircraft before every flight, carefully checking engines, weapons and fuel systems. Navigators studied maps and weather conditions, while intelligence officers analyzed photographs of enemy factories and transportation networks. All of these efforts combined to create the massive bombing operations that filled the skies over Europe during the final years of the war. By 1944 and 1945, the strategic bombing campaign had grown into one of the largest air operations in history. Factories were damaged, transportation networks were disrupted, and German air defenses were gradually worn down by the constant pressure of Allied air power. The B-17 Flying Fortress became one of the most recognizable symbols of this campaign. Its distinctive shape with 4 engines and multiple gun turrets appeared in countless photographs and news reports. For the crews who flew these missions, the aircraft represented both protection and responsibility. They trusted the strength of the bomber to keep them alive while they carried out some of the most dangerous missions of the war. When the war in Europe finally came to an end in 1945, the B-17 had completed thousands of missions and dropped enormous quantities of bombs on strategic targets across the continent. The aircraft had helped demonstrate the power of long-range strategic bombing, and its impact on modern warfare would influence military planning for many years after the conflict. Today the B-17 Flying Fortress remains one of the most famous aircraft of the Second World War, remembered not only for its powerful design but also for the courage of the crews who flew it into some of the most heavily defended skies in history.